What's happening in the Middle East is a disaster. People call it a deal or a negotiation. Would you call it a deal if somebody put a gun to your head and said, unless you give me $1,000, I will shoot you, and you give them the $1,000? It's not a deal. That's a crime. There was a ceasefire on October 6th, and obviously Hamas broke it. The only resolution in the Middle East is the complete and total destruction of Hezbollah and all of the Iranian proxies, and ultimately regime change in Iran.
But do you think right now America is in a position where we should go kinetic to achieve regime change in Iran?
If I were President Trump and if President Trump asked me for my advice, here's what I would say to him.
It's an incredible honor to be speaking with you. I recall when I first met you, it was in a Newsmax green room, and you came with your lovely wife, and I got to chat with you for a few moments. And then later, when I was guest hosting on Newsmax, there was some legal matter afoot in the news cycle. And they said, well, who would you want to talk to about this? And I said, well, I mean, if we could ever get Professor Dershowitz. And so now to have an extended discussion with you, I've followed your career in law and academia. I followed your commentary closely on global affairs, domestic affairs. And I kind of want to start talking about what's going on in the world right now, because you are such an expert in Middle Eastern politics, in the politics of Israel. We've got this fragile ceasefire that seems to be holding, but I'd love your perspective on just where we stand right now in the Middle East, and whether or not this ceasefire has a potential to deliver on some safety or security.
Happy to do it. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on with you.
Yeah, please. So share your perspective on what's happening in the Middle East. Is your risk high that an IRS agent is about to show up at your home over unpaid taxes or unfiled returns? Or that the IRS is about to freeze your bank accounts? That would be terrible. Look, understanding your IRS risk, that helps you decide how quickly you need to act. And take my advice, you can find out. You can call the Tax Network experts at Tax Network USA to share your situation. They'll advise if they believe your risk level is high, moderate, or low. This is a free service for my audience. It's 100% confidential. It costs you nothing. And if your risk is high and you want to resolve your IRS problems, Tax Network USA will do it. Nobody knows the IRS better than these folks. In fact, Tax Network USA has a preferred direct line, so they know which agents to deal with, and perhaps more importantly, which agents to avoid. They've resolved over $1 billion in tax debt, so whether you owe $10,000 or $10 million, their genius strategies are designed to help you quickly settle your tax problems. Discovering your current IRS risk, that is fast, free, and confidential, and it'll tell you what level it's at. So the smart first thing to do in solving your tax problems is to call Tax Network USA at 1-800-958-1000. That's 1-800-958-1000. Or you can visit tnusa.com/Matt.
What's happening in the Middle East is a disaster. People call it a deal or a negotiation. Israel has to give up hundreds, perhaps thousands of mass murderers in exchange for innocent people. That's not a deal. That's not a negotiation. That's an extortion. Would you call it a deal if somebody put a gun to your head and said, unless you give me $1,000, I will shoot you, and you give them the $1,000? That's not a deal. That's a crime. And what Hamas demanded of Israel in exchange for doing what they should have done in the first place, returning innocent babies and grandmothers and children, is a horrible thing. And it just encourages other groups to take hostages. We're going to see more hostage taking. And so, although I understand what Israel did, it had to do it. Israel's a country with a heart, and it can't allow its hostages to be kept forever or killed or raped. It had to do what it did, but it's going to be very costly, not only to Israel in the future, but to other countries as well. The only resolution in the Middle East is the complete and total destruction of Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and all of the Iranian proxies, and ultimately regime change in Iran. Without regime change in Iran, unless Iran stops being the head of the octopus, it's just going to cause more and more and more problems, and we'll never see a peaceful resolution. Because as Bill Clinton said many years ago, when he tried to bring about the deal, he offered the Palestinians a state on over 100% of the land they then had, 96% on the West Bank and close to 5% in Israel. They said no. And Clinton said recently, they're not interested in their own homeland. They're just interested in killing Jews and making Israel uninhabitable. And so when the media like CNN tries to portray Israel and Hamas in a kind of similar light, or when the International Criminal Court indicts both Hamas and Israeli leaders, suggesting that they're equally culpable, it just encourages this kind of thing. And we're never going to move toward real peace.
Well, there's a lot there, and I'm dying to get to regime change in Iran, but to the matter of this particular ceasefire agreement, like, would you have made this agreement if you were Netanyahu?
Israel's a democracy, and so you have to listen to the people. I think if Bibi Netanyahu, who I've known since 1970, that's how long we go back. I knew him when his name was Ben Natai, and he was at MIT studying in the business school and starting a furniture company. That's how far.
Wow.
I think if it was up to Bibi alone, if he was czar or the king, he wouldn't have done it. But in a democracy, you have to listen to the people. And the vast majority of Israelis said, do what you have to do to get back the hostages. So he is the servant of the people. But he's not happy.
So the ceasefire contemplates this ongoing negotiation as these rounds of hostage exchanges go on. And I can tell you, Professor, I've talked to my colleagues who are my former colleagues who are on the intelligence committee, and I've said, have you even been briefed about these hundreds of people who are being released, some of whom had life sentences? Are you being briefed on where they're going, what ongoing security threat they may pose to the United States, to Israel, what networks are accepting them or embedding them? And they're getting nothing. They're getting no information about how threatening some of these individuals may be to our security, which is deeply troubling. Right. But put yourself, I mean, you're one of the world's great negotiators. Put yourself at these at the table where you've got political pressure domestically to continue the ceasefire, to get all of the hostages back, but then you've got the risk that the features of the deal create moral hazard, create an incentive structure to take more hostages. What does Alan Dershowitz do sitting across the table from Hamas to get a reasonable deal done to balance those objectives?
Well, what you do is not endanger the national security of your country or the national security of your allies. You give as little as you have to get as much as you have to. Donald Trump is a great negotiator, and I think he understands that that's what has to be done. But Trump is also putting some pressure on Israel right now to comply with the second part of the deal because, President Trump wants to see himself as a successful deal maker. He wants to be the one who did what the Biden administration couldn't do, brought about a real ceasefire. Now, remember, there was a ceasefire on October 6th, and obviously Hamas broke it, killed 1,200, kidnapped 250. Hezbollah broke it, the Houthis broke it. So ceasefires aren't worth the paper they're written on. The key is for Israel not to give up strategic interests. That's why it's important for it to maintain control over the Philadelphia corridor. Yeah, it's going to have to release some terrible people. And, some of the networks do an awful job. CNN, they could have interviewed any of the people released recently. They could have interviewed rapists who were released, mass murderers who were released, and shown the truth about what Israel had to do. Instead, they pick one person to release, a female who claimed to be a journalist, who was with her family and her children, and CNN made it sound like it was an equal trade. Oh, a nice woman was brought back to Israel, and a nice woman was given back to the Palestinians. But that's not what happened. Israel had to give up all these horrible, horrible murderers and killers and rapists. One of the people it has to give up is a man who not only committed murders, but then when he was in prison, raped the Israeli prison guard who was taking care of him. And now that person has to be released. Now, does it really do good for the Palestinians to have these people sent back and made heroes? They're going to have statues, streets named after them. Their families are going to be paid. It's murder for hire, basically. It's like the mafia or Murder Incorporated. It's just called Hamas. I just wrote a new book, a short book to be given out to college students all over the country about the 10 big lies involving Israel and how to respond to them. We printed free 1 million copies to be given to college students. And anybody else who wants the book, you can get it on Amazon for just a couple of bucks. And I'm doing a new book now. I never stop. I'm 86 years old. If I were 26 years old, I'd be in Gaza, hopefully as part of Israel Defense Forces, or I would have been in the United States trying to protect our troops. But I'm 86, so all I have is a ballpoint pen that I write with. So I have a new book coming out also called Palestinianism, that is the focus only on the rights of Palestinians to the exclusion of everybody else and only on the alleged wrongs of Israel. So, we have two wars that are being fought, one on the battlefield, but the other in the court of public opinion. And both are very important. That's why I really, really encourage shows like yours, podcasts like yours, to invite people to inform the American public about the truth of what's going on, because they're not getting it on CNN, they're not getting it on MSNBC, and they're not getting it from the New York Times.
So does your new book draw any conclusions about what the future is for Gaza? Is it forever an Israeli occupation of that area? Is it moving all of those people into the Sinai? Israel has been, I think, falsely accused of genocide. I don't believe that Israel's goal is genocide in Gaza, but when you see the death and destruction there, in large part because of the way Hamas has chosen to fortify itself among the populace, literally underneath the populace, I think any reasonable person understands that. But I have a hard time thinking, if someone asked me, well, Matt, what should the future of Gaza actually be, and what should Israel's obligation be in that?
Well, Israel made a serious mistake in 2005. The head of the Israeli government at the time was General Arik Sharon, a friend of mine. And he actually called me in when I was in Israel, and he said, you know what I'm going to be doing? I'm going to be ending the occupation. Israel occupied the Gaza Strip between the time it won the 67 war in 2005. We're going to be ending the occupation. We're going to be taking all the civilians that live there out and all the military. And I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I think you're making a terrible mistake by taking out the military. I think you are right to take out the civilians, but the military has to stay there. Any country has a legal obligation to maintain military presence in an occupied area if there's still resistance. So I think Israel made a mistake. They should have kept their military there. They cannot allow Hamas to come back. Look, if President Trump could bring about what he wanted to bring about, and that is to take the people from Gaza and put them in areas that are less vulnerable to attack against Israel, it would be worth thinking about it. But I don't think it's feasible with 2 million people. And so there are other ways that have to be dealt with. But the one thing that can't be done is allowing Hamas to come back and rule the Gaza Strip. Perhaps, conceivably, maybe the Palestinian Authority. But remember, the Palestinian
They
Authority
had no control. They had no, that's ultimately the real problem, is there's no one to make peace with who can enforce that peace on the non-Israel side, because they are so splintered and functionally ungovernable. And I am amazed that Hamas has not already violated the ceasefire. I guess they're getting such a benefit from all of the release of their prisoners, they're willing to maintain that. But Professor Dershowitz, I want to push back a little on your theory that the medium term here is an Israeli IDF soldiers walking the streets of Gaza. The United States learned that lesson in Baghdad and in Mosul, like that doesn't work. That when you have your soldiers occupying an Arab land that is not yours, you create more targets, you inspire more terrorism, you feed you create a platform where the false narratives that we have to push back against with strong speech are able to fester. Why would you want Israeli troops having to endure that and then potentially seeing the creation of more terrorists than you vanquish?
Well, the question is, what's the alternative? Remember what happened?
I don't know. I admittedly say I struggle with it.
Let's think about some history. The United States vanquished completely, unconditional surrender, Japan and Germany in 1945. I remember, I was 7 years old. I went to parades on the streets. We were holding American flags and we were kissing and hugging our cousins and uncles and aunts who had come back from serving in Germany and Japan. And what did we do? The United States totally militarily occupied both Japan and Germany. And then we created a Marshall Plan. We rebuilt Germany. And the Germans became our best allies, our strongest supporters. The Japanese became our biggest business trade partners. And today they're two of the best countries in the world. It's so interesting. They did a poll to show you how quickly history works. They did a poll asking people, what are the best countries in the world? Rank them. And Japan and Germany were at the very, very top of the list. These are people who were genocidal monsters just, less than a century ago. And so there is a potential for making peace if the peace comes also with rebuilding. The problem is when we tried to rebuild Gaza, the European community, America, all the money went to Hamas. None of the money went to people, and they were used to build these underground tunnels which are really Hamas today
Well, and
control.
Bibi blessed some of that. I mean, Bibi told some of these Gulf monarchies, you know what? I do want food getting in there. I do want water getting in and other resources just to preserve some semblance of society in the belief that that helped Israel as well. So when Bibi had the opportunity to choke off all of the lifeblood for Hamas, I think he didn't, right?
No, in fact, I was slightly involved in that. I was in Qatar visiting with the emir of Qatar at his request, and he was saying that he was going to be sending food and other stuff to the Gaza. And I said, well, won't that just strengthen Hamas? And he said to me, well, call the following Israeli general. He gave me the name and number. And I called the Israeli general, and he basically said, yeah, we have to feed and maybe it'll help. But it didn't help, obviously. All the money was diverted. And I think one of the things that has to happen is if money goes back into Gaza or into the West Bank, it has to be controlled from outside. It can't be controlled by Hamas. It can't be controlled by the Palestinian Authority.
I don't think it can be controlled by the IDF, though. I think that you almost have to get some of these Gulf monarchies who now want access to Western markets, who have those relationships with the Israeli generals and Israeli intelligence, even if they don't want to talk about it publicly. You and I both know that it's true. I think they need to be held responsible to go in and rebuild and govern Gaza and not have it be a place of violence. I honestly only think that some of those entities trying hard to turn west in their behaviors have to prove it in Gaza.
And I think if I were President Trump, I would go to the leaders of the Emirate countries, those that are part of the Abraham Accords, and Saudi Arabia, who is not part of the Abraham Accords yet, and say, look, you have a responsibility here. We will help you, but you have a responsibility. And make peace with Israel, join the Abraham Accords, the countries that haven't yet joined, then use your good offices, resources to help build up the Palestinian entity so that maybe in the future, not now, but maybe in the future, a disarmed Palestinian state could be established living in peace side by side with Israel. It's a dream. I don't think it's in the near future. Look, I have been to Ramallah. Ramallah is a wonderful, beautiful city right in the middle of the West Bank. It is a Palestinian state. There are no Israelis, no soldiers, no police, no citizens are allowed there. I was allowed to go there at the request of the prime minister of the Palestinian Authority, asked to see me, gave me a wonderful lunch. We had a good time. I brought my son. I saw all these fancy cars, electronic stores. It was what could be the beginning of a Palestinian entity. It has to be built. You can't just recognize a Palestinian state and say, look, you've done terrorism for 100 years now. We're going to reward you for giving you a state. You know, when Winston Churchill went to Palestine in 1907 or 8, very early on, and he said, they asked him, should there be a Jewish state in Palestine? And Churchill said, what do you mean should there be? There is. They already have newspapers, universities. They have built the superstructure of a state. And then years later, in 1948, the reality was recognized that Israel was a state. Right now, the Palestinians do not have the structure of statehood. They can't even control the violence in their own areas. Part of the problem is that they keep the refugees in these camps that are festering and are the causes of more and more terrorism. And I think the Palestinian leadership has always wanted to keep its refugees mad, angry at Israel, so that Israel will always have an enemy. You know, Bill Clinton, just before this election, it was, I think, in November, early in November, late October, he gave a statement in Michigan to Michigan voters, many of whom are Arab and Muslim. And he said to them, look, Hamas doesn't want a state. All they want to do is kill Israelis and make Israel uninhabitable. And you can't expect to get a state when you've turned down what Clinton offered and what Ayad al-Merit offered and what others have offered. You just can't do that. And right now, the fault is completely on the side of the Palestinian leadership, not the Palestinian people. Palestinian people are divided. Some would like to see peace. Others would not like to see peace. When they've had elections, they haven't had one in 18 years, they voted for Hamas. So it's not encouraging.
No, and the concept you describe regarding creating a nation is basically the same concept you downscale when a community wants a city. You have to show that you have the basic things that make up a city. And if you wanted to create a new county, you had to show that you had a place to have the county seat and to have the courthouse. And you can scale that all the way up to nation building. But I do think we learned that if the United States goes on a nation building spree, or Israel does, or anyone else does, you're creating more targets in the absence of some security structure. And so the operative question in Gaza is, who can create that security structure? I don't think Israel can. I don't think the United States can. I think it's going to have to be the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, to the extent that the Turks want to behave well, them additionally. So I got to get to regime change in Iran, because everybody says, okay, maximum pressure, sanctions, do what you can to encourage some of the freedom of speech that is trying to emerge there. But do you think right now America is in a position where we should go kinetic to achieve regime change in Iran? And I say that as a skeptic of a lot of these Middle East wars, where we go in believing that some Jeffersonian democracy is about to emerge out of a sand dune, and the result, some guy who was in Al-Qaeda just got recognized as the Syrian president. So I don't know that regime change in Syria went well. Defend that concept and how far you would take it.
Here's the way I would do it. I think the United States and Israel have never been in a better position in relation to Iran for two reasons. Number one, Israel destroyed Iran's air defenses and made their nuclear and oil facilities vulnerable. But most important, we now have a president of the United States who is credible on this issue. And if I were President Trump, and if President Trump asked me for my advice, here's what I would say to him. I would say, do not go after Iran's nuclear facilities or oil facilities at this point. Tell the Iranian people you have 3 months to completely demolish your nuclear program, to end your support for Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. And within 3 months, if that's not completely done, we will go kinetic. Within 3 months, we, the Israelis, maybe some other allies, will together destroy your nuclear facilities and your oil facilities.
Do you worry that invites first strike from Iran?
Iran doesn't have the capacity for a first strike, and Israel has the capacity
to strike Israel? Okay. You're not worried about a real first strike on Israel from Iran. America, let's get one thing straight. President Trump is working hard to restore our greatness and a vision for success for the country. But other nations, bad actors, they are not going to take Trump's victory and his agenda lightly. They're furious, and now it could be your savings, your retirement in their crosshairs. Inflation is rising. The Federal Reserve says that 2025 could be even worse, and your 401k or IRA could be next on the chopping block. During Trump's first term, gold soared over 50%. In 2024, it crushed the S&P 500, proving once and again gold is the ultimate safe haven in times of chaos. And silver, it climbed an impressive 23% last year, and it could skyrocket in 2025. If you ever thought about protecting your money, now is the time. That's why I trust Golden Crest Metals. Right now, they're offering a free wealth protection guide to help you shield your savings with gold and silver. And here's the kicker. You can get up to $25,000 in free silver with qualified purchases. Don't wait until it's too late. Call 833-752-2083 or visit goldencrestmetals.com now. That's 833-752-2083. Other countries, the deep state, they're not waiting, and you shouldn't either. Protect your savings. Call Golden Crest Metals at 833-752-2083 or visit goldencrestmetals.com today.
I can tell you very much that if Iran thought it had the capacity to do it, it would have done it. The former president of Iran said, look, Israel's a one-bomb state. All you have to do is one bomb in Tel Aviv and Israel ceases to exist. I think you ask Israel, you make sure that they're on board, and I would bet you anything that the vast majority of Israelis would approve of this approach. And I would bet, too, that Iran would back down. Now, would they back down honestly? Of course not. They would try to hide this and hide that, the same way they did with when they had the original plan under President Barack Obama. They cheated. But today you can catch cheaters more easily than you did in the past. And I have to tell you, a cheating, weak country is better than a country like Iran today, which boasts about its ability to create a nuclear arsenal within months. That has to be put an end to, because there's nothing more dangerous than a country that's weak militarily, but only has nuclear weapons. If you have a country that's strong militarily, it's not going to need to use its nuclear weapons. But Iran has no army, it has no air force, it has no capabilities beyond the possible threat of nuclear weapons. And I do think also, if you destroy Iran's nuclear weapons, or if you get Iran to back away and destroy its own nuclear weapons, the process of regime change over time internally will be encouraged. So I think it's a win-win for America and a lose-lose for the Iranian mullahs and a win-win for the Iranian people. Look, if you had an election today in Iran, a fair election, 80-20 against the regime, the polls, no matter how inaccurate they are, definitely show that the vast majority of Iranians hate the Iranian regime today, and it's only controlled by the Revolutionary Guard and the fact that they just throw people off the roof if they dissent or don't like them. But speaking of that for a second, how does anybody understand the fact that in America, people from the hard left, gays from the hard left, people support Hamas? If they ever went to Iran, or they went to Gaza, or they went to Lebanon, they'd be murdered in the streets, they'd be thrown off the roofs. And yet these are people who are protesting Israel, which Tel Aviv was voted the city most welcoming of gays. And the gay community hates Israel, not all, but many of the leaders of the gay community hate Israel. Many of the people from the hard left hate Israel.
I don't think that's actually a lot of them. I think that a lot of these people don't even know what they're protesting. I think that they have a general angst with power structures. And they say, the powerless need my particular voice, because oftentimes these are very lonely people who have not achieved their own goals in life. You don't see like the highly successful out there camping in the lawn. It's people that something didn't go right for them for some reason, and they blame power for having done that to them, and they simply associate Israel with power. And I think it's foolish.
And there's another point too. Israel is meritocracy.
Right.
Israel is meritocratically successful country in modern history. And American Jews are successful meritocratically. And the hard left hates meritocracy. They hate people like you and me who made it by our hard work. They want people to be rewarded only by identity politics. I mean, even just before we went on recording this today, President Trump was on the air talking about how you have to have meritocracy when you pick air controllers. You can't have air controllers picked based on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think the American public has come to agree with that. That's why he won the election, I think, largely in part as a reaction to how the left has destroyed meritocracy. And the idea that the world turns against meritocratically successful groups and nations says something very bad about the future of the world. And I hope it will be reversed under President Trump.
So I want to get back to your book that you've sent out to college campuses, because President Trump also signed this executive order calling for a review of the threats of anti-Semitism emerging on college campuses. And then he ordered he pitched a plan to basically deport the people who had overstayed their visas, but who were causing educational disturbances and interrupting classrooms as a result of their association with Hamas. And so when I saw him sign that order, I thought, I'm sure Professor Dershowitz would support this, but we also know you can't have particular punishments of the government append to people based on their speech. So how do you parse that where you achieve the necessary government objective without violating the First Amendment principles we both hold dear?
So we have to go back 5 years. So 5 years ago, President Trump drafted, and his people drafted, a statement about colleges and universities. I helped draft that statement. I worked on it. And I put in the part saying that nothing in this statement can be done in violation of existing law, including the First Amendment. That statement is in this one as well. The statement that I drafted 5 years ago is back in this statement as well. So everything that is done in the name of preventing anti-Semitism and reducing it on college campuses has to be done consistent with existing constitutional law. Now, yes, you can deport somebody who's here on a visa. Remember, they have no constitutional rights. They're here as our guests. And if they use their status as university students, and remember, these are not people who only turn against Israel, they turn against America. These are people who hate America. These are people who are yelling intifada, revolution, revolution, and they burn American flags. There's no reason why we have to welcome these people. A lot of funding on universities is being done by Qatar and by other Arab and Muslim entities in order to encourage more and more of these students to come to America. But we have the right. We have the right to control our borders. We have the right, and it doesn't interfere with free speech. These people can go back to their countries. Today, with the internet, they can say whatever they want. We can't ban them on the internet. They can express their views, but there's no reason why a person who hates America and who campaigns against America should be given a scholarship at Harvard.
Harvard's changed a lot. You were a student there, professor there, and it had such a mystique of merit and excellence. And it's for my children and their children. I think Harvard is going to, and a lot of these Ivy Leagues are going to be viewed very differently. And it's sad in a way because we want great American institutions to always hold that place of reverence. But they've really done it to themselves, I think. I do, Professor. I want to go away from foreign affairs and I want to talk to you a little bit about the law, because you have represented some of the most interesting people in the world. You've been involved in some of the most interesting cases. And I remember watching the O.J. Simpson trials and seeing you go from commentator to one of the litigators, one of the lawyers. And just before we get into all of that, going from being someone on television talking about a case to then being right in the middle of that, what was that transition like?
It's a very interesting story because what happened was I was commentating on the case. I had been on NBC Today show the morning that they discovered the bodies. And I said, it seems like he probably is guilty. Usually it's the husband when you have a case of a spouse being killed. And he'll probably come in with some abuse excuse. But it looks at this moment in time like he probably did it. A few days later, I get a phone call from Bob Shapiro saying, we need you to be on the defense team. They're seeking the death penalty, and we know you oppose the death penalty. And I said, Bob, I'd love to do it, but I can't. I've already said I think he's guilty. And Shapiro said, well, everybody thinks he's guilty, but we need you to help save him from the death penalty and, maybe raise some constitutional questions. So I agreed to do that, and I changed my role from commentator to litigator, and the rest we all know.
Yeah, that was at the time the greatest assembly of legal talent that anybody had seen, and then we got to watch it all play out on television. You read about, whether it's in sports or in politics, different teams of rivals that get together with different chemistries or not. I don't want you to relitigate the case for me, but just the team dynamic of being around personalities like Johnny Cochran and F. Lee Bailey and Barry Scheck with that very niche, he brought all of America up to understanding DNA and what it was. What was the team dynamic like with so many highly accomplished people having to work toward one objective?
It was very difficult. I didn't call it the dream team. I called it the nightmare team. Everybody was arguing with each other all the time. I was basically living in Cambridge and teaching at Harvard. I would fly out to California, once every 2 weeks or so for a couple of days and deal with the team and maybe argue a case or argue a motion here and there. But so I was not part of the disputes, but Bob Shapiro didn't get along at all with F. Lee Bailey and some of the other people really at each other's throats. I remember F. Lee Bailey said, we don't want Barry Scheck to argue the DNA because he's too New York. Well, I don't know what that was supposed to mean, but he did a great job. But
was he saying he was too Jewish?
I don't know. I couldn't tell what he meant by that, but he was too New York, and he is New York, and I'm New York. And
sure.
The jury was an interesting jury. It was predominantly a minority jury, but it also had a woman who we called the demon because she had a white woman who had previously
Marcia Clark.
Well, Marcia Clark was the prosecutor,
Oh, yeah.
but one of
the jurors,
a librarian, and she had previously been on a jury, and the jury had voted 11-1 for acquittal on the first vote, and she had persuaded them to go 12-0 for conviction. So we were desperately trying to knock her off the jury, but we couldn't. And ultimately, she voted in favor of an acquittal, which surprised us all. We thought it would be a hung jury. And then about 2 weeks later, she got on television and said she regretted her vote, but she did vote for acquittal. Look, the problem with the case is the prosecutor framed somebody they believed was guilty. The prosecutors all believed, and understandably based on the evidence, that OJ did it, was guilty. They also thought that this team of lawyers keep him out of prison, and particularly because there were some questions about the search and the seizure. So they actually created a piece of evidence. We know the name of the policeman who did it, Van Adder. He took home with him, this is all documented, he took home with him the blood of O.J. Simpson, the blood of the victims, and the sock. And he poured the blood on the sock. How do we know that? Because if you have a sock and you're wearing it and you're running through a killing field, you will find a splatter evidence. One side of the sock and the inside and the outside will be the same exactly, a mirror image. But then the other side, on the other side of the leg, won't be a mirror image. But we discovered that there were 4 mirror images, which meant that the blood was put on the sock, not while it was being worn by somebody, but while it was being flat on the table. Not only that, but we determined that there was a chemical called EDTA in the blood on the sock. And EDTA is not found in the human body. It's put in test tubes to prevent coagulation. So we were able to prove conclusively, and every one of the 12 jurors agreed with this, that the police had planted a piece of evidence. But many of the jurors thought he was still guilty. And so the question came up, what do you do if you think the police planted evidence against the guilty person? And, reasonable people could disagree with that. Some people say, no, you should quit. Some people say, no, you should convict anyway, he's guilty. And they acquitted, largely because they distrusted the government's case.
Do you think that that's right, that a jury should acquit if they're trying to frame a guilty person, just as a principle of law?
Hard question. I think it would depend on the crime. I think for a murder, maybe not. Maybe not for a murder. Maybe if it's a less serious crime. I remember Johnny Cochran said to the jury, if you don't send a message to these police, these corrupt police, this was the LA police under Gaetz, which was really being run by Marines, former Marines, and they were using Army tactics. And of course, we had the famous racist policeman who used the N-word repeatedly, and it was a predominantly black jury, and the predominantly black jury did say to themselves, we believe that this evidence was planted. I think reasonable people could go either way. That's why I predicted it would be a hung jury. I did not think there would be an acquittal. I didn't think there would be a conviction. But I thought there'd be a hung jury, and I was wrong.
You also represented Julian Assange, and could you just give a brief intro on the context of that representation? He's seeking a pardon now. Do you believe he's deserving of one, as we have the benefit of some history now to evaluate his actions?
Well, I go back on this issue a long time ago. I was one of the lawyers in the Pentagon Papers cases. I represented Senator Mike Gravel from Alaska, who read the Pentagon Papers into the congressional record in order to give them immunity from prosecution. And so I make a very, very sharp distinction between the people who did the stealing of the papers, Snowden, Ellsberg. These are criminals, and they should be prosecuted. I believe that people who steal material from the government, people who have security clearance, and who violate their oath are appropriately prosecuted. That's not the New York Times, and it's not Assange. Assange was much more like the New York Times. They published it. Assange was the publisher. Now, Assange was accused of trying to encourage people to find information to give to him, but that's true of journalists as well. New York Times reporters like Seymour Hersh develop their sources. They encourage them to go in and get information to give to them. So I make a sharp distinction between people like Assange and like the New York Times who published consistent with the First Amendment, these material, and people who've done the actual stealing. And now, we know that some of the people who did the stealing have been pardoned. So yes, I would be in favor of pardoning Julian Assange.
You've had such a storied career in law. Is there a greatest accomplishment in any of these global negotiations or domestic matters you've been involved in that you say, this was the pinnacle of my work in the law?
Oh yeah, it's not even a close case, and that was my defense of a man named Anatoly Sharansky. Anatoly Sharansky was a dissident in the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Soviet Union tried him initially for treason, with the death penalty. And I was able to get President Carter to announce that Sharansky had not given any material to the United States, who was not an American spy. So the death penalty was taken off the table. Then I went to the Soviet Union along with another professor, Erwin Kotler, who ultimately became the Minister of Justice in Canada. And we defended Anatoly Sharansky for 8 years and kept him alive. And eventually he got out of prison and became a minister in Israel. And I remember the moment he crossed the Gleiniki Bridge from East Germany to West Germany. And I had tears in my eyes. And I welcomed him to New York when he came there just a few days later. And it was a pro bono case. I spent thousands of dollars defending him. I didn't make any money, but it was the greatest victory of my career, partly because I identified so strongly with him. My parents and grandparents came from the same part of Poland and Ukraine that his great-grandparents came from. And his family took a turn to the right and went to Moscow. My family took a turn to the left and went to Brooklyn.
Wow.
And there, but of guard, I might have been the dissident and he might have been the lawyer. So, and Sharansky and I are very close friends to this day. I'm probably going to see him 2 weeks from now in Florida, where he's coming to make a speech. So that was the greatest legal accomplishment in my life.
Well, that's remarkable. And you most certainly would have been a dissident had you gone that direction, given your nature. I want to shift now and talk a little bit about politics. Have you ever thought about running for office? And have people ever tried to encourage you? I mean, you have all of the skills of people who run for office.
When I grew up in Brooklyn, and I was president of the student government of Brooklyn College, and I was active in Democratic politics, people kept saying you should be the congressman from Brooklyn. But, you know, I had an offer from Harvard to become the youngest professor in its history. And I decided, no, I didn't want to get into politics. Then I was offered a judgeship when I was in my middle 30s. And I thought about that a lot, federal judgeship, Ted Kennedy. And I said to myself, I looked in the mirror, I said, I'm not a judge. I'm not an umpire. I'm an athlete.
Yes.
I don't want to be, I want to be the litigant. I want to be the guy fighting. So I decided not to do that. And then when Carter got elected, Newsweek gave a list of people he might appoint to the Supreme Court. And I was on that list. And of course, if my mother was still alive, I would have taken that job if it wasn't. But I've been very happy being a litigator. As I said, I'm 86 years old and I'm still litigating cases. And I'm still advising people and fighting and trying my best to bring justice to people who can't get justice. So I'm happy with the career I've had. It's not been easy. I've made a lot of enemies. For example, we summer on Martha's Vineyard. I've been on Martha's Vineyard for 53 years. You know when I first went there? I went there when a guy called me and said, Senator Ted Kennedy is driven off a bridge.
Wow.
Somebody's dead. Could you get to the vineyard to help represent him? And I got to Martha's Vineyard for the first time. It was the day the astronauts landed on the moon. It was a big day. And I went to the vineyard all those years since. Now, nobody on the vineyard talks to me because I defended Donald Trump in front of the United States Senate against an unconstitutional impeachment. And people like you talk to me and befriend me. But my old friends, my liberal Democrat friends, want to have nothing to do with me. I've basically been thrown out of the Democratic Party. And I am not a Republican. I'm an independent. And I'm going to live the rest of my life as an independent, voting for whoever I think is the best person for the job at the time.
Well, that really segues into what I wanted to discuss, and that is my belief that we are in a time of great political realignment. You talked earlier in our discussion about the hard left or the hard right. Sometimes I don't even know what that means anymore, because the things that used to define what a Democrat was, what a civil libertarian was, what a Republican was, not only do they not apply in that same doctrinal way today, at times they are exactly the opposite.
Exactly. You're completely right.
I like, so I thought, by the way, this is so fun to ask a great law professor a bunch of questions, because I spent years as a law student always in some apprehension about being asked questions in the Socratic method. But I want to ask you a binary question on which party, Democrat or Republican, fits the description. So which party would you say is the pro-war party today?
I hope neither party is the pro-war party, but I do think that President Trump managed to have 4 years, without any war. And I think he's somebody who really thinks he can negotiate himself out of any need to use kinetic force. And if the Republicans become the party of negotiation and they succeed, I'd be very happy with that.
Yeah, and I would even be more strident. I would say the Republicans are more anti-war than the Democrats, because if you just look at the votes in Congress on questions like Ukraine, all the Democrats vote for war in Ukraine, and then about 40% of the Republicans do. And then that is the coalition to fund Ukraine. And you can agree or disagree with the propriety of sending weapons to Ukraine, but just on the pure politics of who contributes the votes for those weapons packages, it is not the Republican Party, it's the Democratic Party. So second one, who is the pro-free speech party today?
In a close question. Today, the Republicans are much better on free speech than the Democrats. The Democrats, many of them are pro-censorship. Free speech for me, but not for thee. And they have done more to hurt free speech on university campuses and in the media. So right now, the Republicans get the better of that. It's not even a close
which we wouldn't have said in the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, you had the moral majority trying to censor everything.
Certainly not when I was in college and I was fighting against McCarthyism, which came from Republicans, not from Democrats. That's changed dramatically. Today, we have the new McCarthyism, and it comes from the left and it comes from the Democrats.
What about free trade? Who's the pro-free trade party today?
And I think the Republicans have become much more kind of libertarian in their approach generally, and free trade is part of that.
You think so? I mean, Trump's out there. Trump can't get through a day without threatening tariffs on somebody. Mexico, Canada, Colombia.
He uses tariffs as a way of implementing foreign policy, but I don't think he actually wants to impose tariffs. He wants people to act in fear of his imposing tariffs and bring factories to the United States and do things that he wants it to be done. But it's interesting. It's complicated. Today, the old issues, free trade versus, tariff war, they're not as simple as they were 100 years ago. We live in a much more complex society, and you're right. We're seeing a major realignment, and I think we're seeing a move to the center as well. And I think one of the reasons that what Trump won is that the Democrats had moved too far to the left, and people were really upset at what they thought a Kamala Harris presidency would look like.
But was it ideological? I mean, this country voted for Obama twice. I don't think the dig on Harris was ideological. I think it was people did not view her as competent. They saw her as phony. And I mean, if you would have told me that Donald Trump would have won this primary election attacking Ron DeSantis from the left on abortion in Iowa, I would have said there's no way. But there we were in the Iowa caucuses, and Trump's out there saying the 6-week abortion ban is way too restricting. And I really do think it is realigned. I don't know that I found all the contours of that realignment, but what I noticed in Congress is it was often just who was corrupt and who wasn't. I mean, if you were willing to do stuff for the highest bidder, this realignment's great because you don't have to believe in anything. And that's why I made common cause frequently with people like Ilhan Omar and AOC on questions of civil liberties when it came to surveillance authority, warrant requirements. It wasn't other Republicans I was working with. It was the populist Democrats. I wonder if there's opportunity in that.
I don't think so. I think the populist Democrats have moved away from libertarianism and much more toward whose side are you on. Yeah. I wouldn't trust you or Ilhan Omar today on issues of surveillance, except that the people surveilled are people that they identify with. I think it's whose axe is being gored and which foot the shoe is on. So I would have much more trust in you as a libertarian than I would in people from the left who are selective libertarians when it serves their own interests.
Yeah, gosh, that's depressing because you are ideologically a civil libertarian. I mean, you're a civil libertarian. That's how I would define your politics if asked. Who do you think is the best president of your lifetime?
It's hard to know. I got to become very friendly with Bill Clinton, but initially I couldn't vote for him because he put on tape saying nasty things about Cuomo, about Governor Cuomo, saying, "Oh, he's all mobbed up." And Governor Cuomo was a friend of mine, the first Governor Cuomo, and I got very upset at Clinton. Then I became friendly with him, and I can tell you an interesting story about him. We spent some time together on the vineyard, and even after he left, and I said, Mr. President, you really had 8 great years. He said, yeah, I had 8 great years, really no wars and no this, no that, no crises, which means I couldn't ever be a great, great president. To be a great president, you have to serve during times of crisis. If Lincoln hadn't served during the Civil War and hadn't been shot, who knows what kind of a president he would have been. Franklin Delano Roosevelt probably would have been a mediocre president. And so timing is everything. And so I think Bill Clinton was a very good president. I think Ronald Reagan, I think the two of them, if you look together at Clinton and Reagan, you see the best of the Democrats and the Republicans.
Well, I think history will look back at Bill Clinton's tenure on a lot of issues very favorably. Economic policies, the way he worked with a divided government to achieve goals that inured to his benefit and the country's benefit. I actually think that's right. And it's interesting, you know, he's not a man without his personal flaws, but I don't, as much as Republicans were just so wrapped up in those for years, I don't really think that's how history is going to view him. I think that maybe our social mores have changed. Maybe we've learned so much about each other through social media that we're maybe less prudish on those questions. There was a final matter I wanted to discuss with you, Professor, and it's another thing you and I have in common, and we probably wish we didn't. And it's having been falsely accused of something.
Yeah.
And I was amazed and at times inspired by the approach you took. Some people, man, they go hide in a hole and they do everything they can to avoid confronting allegations. And you wrote a book. You took all of the information on these grisly subjects and the transcripts and the admissions and the timelines, and you were so forceful in promoting the defense of yourself. And now, of course, your matter was resolved with this person who was, I guess, accusing you, acknowledging that her own confusion and indicating that it was likely a matter of confused identity. And yet you were subjected to this for all these years on like a confusion of identity matter. You know, I know that even when you're vindicated by something like that, the vindication only goes so far. And you still have to endure the grisliness of the allegations. And as someone who's had to go through that life cycle myself, I'm just eager to hear your reflections on your approach to that.
Well, it was very easy for me because, you know, I live a very, very, you know, private life privately. I love my wife. I've been with her 40 years. I've never touched or flirted with another woman during that period of time. And I wasn't afraid of depositions. People could ask me about anything. I never did anything wrong sexually in my life. Very few people can really say that under oath. For example, Prince Andrew couldn't be deposed. Even if he was falsely accused of that crime, there were so many other things he had to settle. I would never in a trillion years settle. And, you know, nobody who knew me believed the allegation because they knew how close I am to my wife and how I would never, ever deviate from her in any way. So it was very easy for me. But I decided that because it was easy for me, I would write a book to help other people who have been falsely, people who have been falsely accused, who don't have perfect records. And look, it's not only Bill Clinton that didn't have a perfect record. Look at John Kennedy. Look at Bobby Kennedy. You know, back in the day, it wasn't expected that politicians would live perfect lives. And then came the Me Too movement, and both of us were caught up in the Me Too movement. And I don't know anything about your matter, so I don't want to comment on it, but I only know about my matter. So it was very, very easy for me to go public. And friends sometimes called me and would say, you know, if you just forget about it, it will go away. And I would say, I don't want it to go away.
Yeah.
I want this to be a lesson to people that if you're falsely accused, you got to fight back and you got to, you know, tell the truth. And so that's what I tried to do. I was successful. But there's still people, you know, for example, whenever I go on a TV show about Israel, I will always get people saying, oh, yeah, don't believe him. Look at what he did with Jeffrey Epstein. And they try to bring that up to hurt my reputation on Israel. But again, I say, look, bring it on, because I'm not afraid of it. I'll tell the truth. And now, you know, I even have the woman herself acknowledging that she may have confused me with someone else. So that was a big plus.
Yeah. I think that's about as good as exoneration can come when you're having to prove you didn't do something decades ago. Like I remember when my colleague Jim Jordan was accused, and he's like, "Oh, great, I have to prove I didn't know something 36 years ago," and it puts people in an impossible situation. And your book is incredible, by the way.
I carry around a little booklet.
Yeah.
Had since I started teaching at Harvard, a little Harvard booklet, and I have them going back to 1964, and so I was able to prove where I was, and we keep our American Express records in the basement, so we were able to show every single day during the whole time that I knew Jeffrey Epstein. I could document where I was every single day, and I couldn't have been in the places where people falsely claimed I was. So for me, again, it was easy, but for others, it's not so easy, and it's not easy to remember where you were 30 or 40 years ago.
Right. And there is the feature, I mean, of sometimes the way allegations emerge is that lies are woven onto the truth. And even things in the truth, not in your case, but in mine, there's certainly mistakes I've made and things I've done that are embarrassing. And so then you weave the whole lives onto the half truths, and then getting into that is most unpleasant. But you have been incredibly generous with your time with me, with your talents with the country. I've really enjoyed the discussion, the wide-ranging discussion, and if I can ever be of service to you, Professor Dershowitz, please let me know, okay?
Sometime.
All right, take care.